Good morning. Welcome to the Deep 404. I suggest that you grab a coffee or a cup of tea. It is Saturday morning and there is a lot to talk about today. I just want to start with the US border, and then I'll get into something of what's going on in Ukraine, and then we'll get into a little bit of the Middle East. But the US, if you've been following Twitter or social media yesterday, one of the top trending terms yesterday and still this morning is civil war. And this relates to the United States of America. Now, America hasn't fallen into civil war yet. But the signs are that there are divides growing, not only along the lines of the political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but also now between state and federal organisations. This centres around Texas, one of the southern states, which borders Mexico. And the governor there is Greg Abbott. He's a Republican governor. Obviously, in the United States, there has been for some time this concern about the porous southern border, where people are able to enter America without any documentation, without going through any sort of vetting process, without the American nation being able to just understand who is entering the country. Obviously, one of the things that are called out as being a possible risk about this is that people who are wishing to enact some sort of domestic terrorist activity on America are able to use this as an avenue to enter the country. Now, whether that's happening or not, I don't know. But certainly the possibility exists that people travel to Mexico from anywhere they wish and then get into America that way. And that is a concern for the Americans, concern for, I think, any nation to not have a handle on, understanding, or ability to monitor and control who is entering the country. So some people will be entering definitely because they need asylum, and this is a way that they can get in. But the concern is that there's no control over this, and nobody knows who is entering. Suggestions are that groups from the Middle East who may be non-friendly organisations to America can travel to Mexico and enter into America that way. Anyhow, so this centres around this. And in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott last September declared what was happening on the Texas borders to be an invasion. So, and there are thousands of people each day entering the United States this way. The numbers estimated over the term of, I think, President Biden's presidency, the 4 years, there's an extremely high number. I think it's estimated at somewhere near 12 million. Now, I hope I haven't got that wrong, but I think that's what I read. I think that during Trump's term, it was maybe 4 million people came in, something along those lines, and Obama before him, perhaps it was 6 or 8 million. But it's a lot of people getting in. It's a few million people a year, it seems, coming in via this avenue. So Greg Abbott, the Republican governor of Texas, declared an invasion. And by doing so, he enabled some additional rights, constitutional rights for the state of Texas. What has just happened recently is that Governor Abbott has taken his state police forces and the National Guard. Now, I'm just going to explain a couple of terms here. The National Guard in America is actually a collection of state-led militias. So Texas has its National Guard and it maintains that force. Now, ultimately, because they're a militia, they're a military force, ultimately, their ultimate control does roll up to Joe Biden, the president, because he's the commander-in-chief of all American armed forces. But in a day-to-day sense, it is a state militia and a state organisation, even though it's called the National Guard. The Border Patrol is a federal organisation. And in America, the actual documented legislated control of America's borders is a federal activity which is enacted by the Border Patrol. So even though your state, let's say Texas, borders another country, Mexico in this case, it's actually the Border Patrol, the federal organisation, that are tasked with carrying out the activity of securing the border. And so this is where the problem has arisen. Greg Abbott has said, well, the federal government and the Border Control are doing nothing to protect our state from this invasion of undocumented migrants. And so we are going to do something ourselves. And part of what they have done has been to lay out, razor wire, barbed wire, concertina wire along the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande River forms part of the border there. In some parts, at certain times, the Rio Grande is shallow and can be walked across. So the Texas state troopers, the Texas National Guard, have put these barriers up and have been enforcing a barrier there. The United States Supreme Court just this week has voted in a 5-4 ruling, which says that the Federal Border Patrol are allowed to remove those barriers. Now, additionally, the Abbott's National Guard and state forces have, in one area, in Eagle Pass, Texas, have been cordoning off an area to a park which borders the river, and they have been stopping the federal forces from getting to the river, to the border, to be able to do their border patrol activities. And instead of being saying, no, you're not doing your job, you're not taking this barbed wire down, we're leaving it up. And so right now in Texas, there is conflict between the state of Texas and their militia forces and security forces and the federal border patrol ones. So this is the sort of the core at the moment. So the Supreme Court has ruled in favour of the federal government and said this is a border patrol activity. Governor Abbott, pull your guys out and let the border patrol do their job. Abbott has come back and said we are suffering under an invasion. Constitutionally, we have the right to protect our state from an invasion, and that outweighs or overrules any legislation at a federal level that you may think that you have. And so there is now this conflict growing between Texas at a state level and the federal government. I'll just show something on the screen here. Let's have a quick look there. So this is a map. Texas is in dark grey down the bottom. But all of these red states here are states where the governors have come out and signed a letter in support of Governor Abbott. So these state governors are all saying, we agree with Texas, that Texas as a state should be able to protect its own borders in a situation where they believe that the federal government is not doing enough to provide that protection. And this is why we're starting to see this term of civil war come out and be used at the moment, because this is an escalation, a growing divide where you can see there's 25 states now, Republican-led states, where their governors have come out in support for Texas. I think there's 51 states at the moment in America, maybe 52, if it counts Puerto Rico. I'm not sure. It's not really my area of expertise, American statehood. Anyhow, it's about that. So we've almost got a 50-50 split here. 26 states, including Texas, who are effectively standing up to the federal government and saying, no, we're not listening to you. You're not protecting the border. Now, the border is a big issue at the moment in the United States. And that issue has got to do with the funding for Ukraine and for Israel. So there are members of Parliament Congress in America who have openly said they no longer wish to fund Ukraine, and they have some concerns about funding Israel. Now, many people in Congress are happy to fund these things, but what has happened is that the leader of the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who's a Republican, he has said, we will not approve any bill to give you your new funding for Ukraine, which amounts to $64 billion for Ukraine and $16 billion for Israel. We will not provide this funding unless we see concrete measures to secure the southern border. The Republicans want the border to be secured because they know that it is a tactic of the Democrats, and this is why the Democrats don't want to secure the border, because the people travelling across the borders will tend to vote for the Democrats. Traditionally, that is what has been the situation here. This is something that the Democrats are relying upon. So if they're getting millions of people come across the border each year, if those people can then be allowed to vote, then you can effectively bank on the fact that you are increasing your share of the vote. So this is you can go and look this up and Google this. This is why Joe Biden's administration is so hesitant to shut down anything on the border. Now, there has been talk this week that at the Senate level, that some deal may be being organised where some concessions will be made by the Democrats around the border. And this will then allow that bill to be passed to the House to unlock the funding for Ukraine and Israel. Now, that still has to get past Mike Johnson. So while the senators might come to some agreement, if Mike Johnson is not happy with it, if it doesn't do enough for the border, then they will reject that bill again. And there will still be a lack of funding going to Ukraine and Israel. There's a lot of pressure on this topic. Clearly, there is a lot of pressure to get funding for Israel. Israel is still getting weapons from the United States. It has been entering into a number of sales deals. It already had existing sales deals. Israel is picking up another 25 F-35s, which will take them from 50 to 75 F-35 fighter jets. They've got 250 or so F-16s already. And there have been two recent packages that have been approved by the Americans. These are sales for ammunition, artillery, and weapons to help Israel in its bombing of Gaza. But it's a very hot topic, and it is being leveraged by the political parties. Yesterday, Mitt Romney came out and said, well, actually, it's even proceeding, it's beginning more intrigue around it now because he's alleging that presidential candidate Donald Trump, ex-president Donald Trump, has spoken to Republican leadership and has said, don't come to an agreement on the border because I want to run on immigration as one of my stump speeches, as one of my platforms to go into the election. You know, I want to be able to criticise Biden on his border policy. If you guys come to an agreement where Biden says, okay, I'm going to tighten up the border, then you've stripped me of a platform to be able to run against him. And there was mention of this. I think Mitch McConnell mentioned this, that this is something they need to consider. Mitt Romney, who doesn't like Donald Trump, has come out and said that this is just, what was the word? Something, it's not dreadful or disgusting or that we've reached this level, something along those lines. But this is politics. This is an election year. And so, again, this is another factor which may lead ultimately to a delay in funding to Ukraine and Israel because, number one, the Republicans want to get the Democrats out. They want Joe Biden out. The border challenge is one that they can use as a real whip to flog Joe Biden with. And so them agreeing on it and letting Biden say, okay, we're going to tighten things up, which will look as though Biden is now getting strong on the border, is not good for Trump running for the election. So I think that we are likely to see this issue grow. Even if there is some concession made by the Democrats and Joe Biden around border policy, I doubt that it will be enacted quickly, and I doubt that it will be enough to actually stop what's going on across the border. For the reasons I've given, primarily because of the voter increase that the Democrats expect to receive from keeping the border porous. Anyhow, so that's a big piece of news that we're seeing today, and it's it's just interesting. I'm just going to reflect this with, what we've seen throughout the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, where, you constantly hear these stories that President Putin of Russia is going to lose his seat. He's going to lose his position. He'll be overthrown. There's mass turmoil. No one really seems to like him. And yet when you go and look at what's actually happening, Russia seems to be very stable at the moment in terms of a country and politically. It doesn't appear to be fracturing right down the middle, as America does at the moment. It's interesting contrast there. Into some other interesting news, and this won't have a direct and immediate effect on Europe, but this is something which may have an impact going forward, is that the Biden administration on Friday has halted approvals for new licenses to export liquefied gas, so natural gas, after the pipelines running between Russia and Germany. The Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged. This stopped delivery of Russian gas into Germany. And Germany was then forced to turn somewhere else, to look to somewhere else to be able to purchase liquefied natural gas from. And the country that seems to have stepped up and provided the most of that, or you could suggest the industry that has benefited most from the Nord Stream pipelines being destroyed, has been the United States. They are now exporting natural gas to Europe, to Germany. Biden is now saying, well, look, for future export licenses, we're going to, I'm not approving them, we're putting a halt on that. If you're not part of particular trade deals with us in Europe, then we're not going to maybe agree to that straight away. And the reason they're doing that is because they think that the shipping of this liquefied natural gas might be impacting the climate and climate change, which is obviously a big thing with the Democrats in the United States, and big thing with Germany. They love their climate change there. So, again, just politics influencing energy in Europe. This news is probably something that areas of Europe don't really want to hear, that there's a possibility of licenses not being extended or not being renewed or provided to them to allow them to be able to receive natural gas. Also seems a silly thing to do for the United States. If you have an opportunity now to sell your gas to Europe, you would think that you would make it easy to sell your gas to Europe rather than putting in things to halt that based upon what is at best very dodgy science about climate change being caused by humans. You may disagree with me on that, but there is a wealth of information indicating that, climate change is true. That means the climate changes, which I agree with. We've got a long historical record of that. But the causality between what humans have done in the last 200 years to influence that climate change, I don't think there's any good science that shows that conclusively. I think more likely is that we're seeing changes in the climate due to the changes in the climate that happen on planet Earth, due to things like the sun, and have happened for billions of years. But anyhow, we can argue about that another day. But the Americans obviously believe that humans are causing, the Biden administration obviously believes that humans are causing climate change, and therefore they're going to look at their gas exports and just see what impact it might have. The Energy Department is going to do a study on this, it seems. I don't know what the outcome of it will be, but I just thought, again, interesting that green policy influencing energy in Europe, much like the German green policy themselves to remove their nuclear generation, has caused a lot of the problems that they're suffering under at the present time. All right, just going to move over to Ukraine a little bit. There is talk that the UK may be willing to supply more Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. But they would do that if Germany will provide them with Taurus missiles. So the UK is saying, well, we don't have a great deal of Storm Shadows left. We will give some more of them to Ukraine, but in order to do that, Germany, you need to give us Taurus missiles so we can stock up our supplies. Again, it feels to me like you can kind of see the hierarchy here in the NATO nations. That the UK will give away Storm Shadows. Now it's getting low on its stocks. Well, we will give away more, but Germany, you need to replenish us. So, this way, Germany's not going to give Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but the UK will give its shorter ranged export grade Storm Shadow missiles, but only if Germany then gives missiles to the UK, which leaves Germany then depleting its stocks of Taurus missiles. But that's better than the UK being depleted. You've got to keep, the UK wants to keep that buffer between itself and Russia, but it's happy to deplete the buffer rather than deplete itself. A cynical approach, I sure you could take that, but honestly, I think in the hierarchy, the UK is higher than Germany, the US is higher than the UK in that NATO hierarchy there. These missiles, the Storm Shadows and the French Scalps, seem to be limited in their ability to inflict damage on the Russian forces and the Russian capability. They have a limited range. They're limited to about 290 kilometres. As I've said before and shown on the map, the closest point of Ukraine to Moscow, it's about 400 or 430 kilometres. And so this is why they're not getting the Taurus missiles from Germany, because they've got a 500 kilometre range. And the concern there is that the Ukrainians might say, oh, great, we've got a missile which we can maybe get through air defences and hit Moscow. Let's do that, which would inflame the situation and would lead to Russia then saying, okay, where did these missiles come from? Oh, they came from Germany. All right, Germany, you're going to cop one. So the Germans are afraid of that. Don't want that to happen. But giving the Storm Shadows and the Scalps is okay because they can't reach that far, so they can't cause that much trouble. But they do seem to be becoming less effective. We do hear reports of Storm Shadows being fired. We don't hear many reports of them successfully striking important targets in Russia or in Crimea. This seems to be due to the adaptation and the learning of Russian air defense systems. Now, Russian air defense systems prior to 6 months ago probably had very little experience with Storm Shadow missiles and Scalp missiles, and just hadn't encountered them in the battlefield. Once it has encountered them, it starts to collect data. That data is analysed and probably distilled and improved into information given back to the Russian air defence systems, the S-300s, 350s and 400s, to make them better able to identify and track and then intercept those missiles. Now, I imagine there's very complex software that's going on in that process of identifying what type of target you've got, and therefore the best way to attack that target, the best type of missile to use for it, the right time to attack it, the best path to intercept it, all of these sort of things. And we know that the air defense systems are increasing in their capabilities. Just in this conflict in Ukraine, we have had reports that the S-350 system has been used in its full automatic mode. And its full automatic mode means that it does its target detection, target acquisition, and firing of missiles in a completely automated fashion. It doesn't require humans in there to trigger those steps. I would suggest, given everything that's going on in the world at the moment, that technology is being assessed and being updated with AI capability, where they would be using all of the known missile information they have to be able to make better decisions on the targeting and the attack path to be used. AI is quite possibly able to look at all that data and identify trends. Well, that's what AI can do, identify trends easily, which humans can't. And those trends might be things like, oh, if it's a storm shadow coming, we're actually best to fire this type of missile in this path and this mode. They'll give us the best chance of destroying it. So those things are coming, meaning to me that the additional Storm Shadow missiles being provided to Ukraine are likely to have limited impact upon this overall campaign. You know, in large numbers, they may be able to strike some areas in Crimea. But it seems as though the Ukrainians are even struggling to get them in larger numbers. Obviously, the Russians are suppressing Ukrainian air capabilities. The Su-34s that use these, their main starfield in Staromakalivka has been hit multiple times. It's sort of in the middle of Ukraine. That airfield has been hit multiple times. In at least one of the attacks on that airfield, it appears as though the existing stockpile of Storm Shadow missiles was struck there. So it's difficult for the Ukrainians to launch Storm Shadows against Russia at this stage. So getting some more from the UK may be of some limited help. But they're still not getting the Taurus missiles, and I'll come back to that a little bit later too, just in this summary. But support is going to continue. So the German Defense Ministry website has released planned, it seems, support for Ukraine in 2024. So it's come out with some information about this is what we are planning to provide to Ukraine. So my understanding is that this isn't all necessarily committed or confirmed, but it is what is planned to be provided. Over the course of 2024, there are 80 Leopard 1 tanks that are going to be provided to Ukraine. And that's 80 of those. Just remember that, because I'm going to go through the weekly summary of what's happened on the front line with the Ministry of Defense. That's the Russian Ministry of Defense reporting about the losses. If we believe that Ministry of Defense reporting, just remember that Germany is going to be providing 80 more tanks in the coming year. 230,000 rounds of ammunition. Now, what's not specified here is what type of ammunition. If this is 230 rounds of 155 millimeter high explosive ammunition, that's quite a big number. You know, that would be a month of ammunition for Ukraine to be able to fight at sort of an offensive level. If they're going through 10,000 rounds a day, what's a bit less than a month? It's 3 weeks. Now, right now, Ukraine is going through about 1,000 or 2,000 rounds of high explosive ammunition a day. So 1,000 to 2,000 across the line. If they were given 230,000 shells tomorrow of high explosive 155 millimeter rounds, they could bump that up to 10,000 rounds a day for 23 days. So while 230,000 rounds sounds a lot, it probably isn't effectively a great deal. Also, because it didn't come out and scream, these are 155 millimeter high explosive rounds, which are the ones that the Ukrainian artillery want. So it's more likely that these are a mix of 152 millimeter tank rounds, mortar rounds of varying sizes, 155 millimeter cluster rounds, which are not as effective in destroying fortified locations. So I would say that that's going to be a mixture of things, and therefore not overly effective and not 230,000 rounds of what the Ukrainian artillery really want. Again, interesting comments, and I was on Twitter yesterday, so if you're interested in the Deep 404, you can find me commenting on things on Twitter. Now, I'm also posting these videos to Twitter, so you can watch them on YouTube or Twitter, whichever suits you better. But I was commenting there about some of the very propaganda commenting channels and saying to some of them, you know, if you were just to provide a more balanced assessment of what is going on, people, I think, would listen to you more. would take you more seriously. I look at some of those obviously very ideological one way or the other channels, and you just see that the bulk of the people that follow them, it seems, are there to mock them. They realise that they're just feeding out propaganda, and so people are mocking them. However, if those channels were to just be more balanced, I think they'd get a wider audience of people going, yeah, you know what you're saying is logical, it makes sense. It mightn't be what I want to hear, but at least what you're saying kind of makes sense. Anyhow, German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius comes out and says that he considers the situation at the front line to be a dead end. He said, in reality, the situation is bogged down. Neither side is moving forward on the ground. Now, I don't know why he says this. Again, people, if they do any research, will go, well, no, Ukraine is moving backwards. It's advancing backwards, if you want to say they're advancing. Russia is moving forward in many areas along the front line. And this is corroborated even by pro-Ukrainian war tracking sites. And the ISW, the Institute of Study of War, and these UA maps, they're showing these daily incremental advances. Avdiivka isn't becoming a positive story for Ukraine. It is slowly being chewed up by the Russians. And this week, the Russians advanced across the fields in the south and have established now a position in the south of Avdiivka, and they are expanding that out. And this is happening all across the line. In Robotny, in Verbova, which were the areas where the Ukrainians pushed the furthest south towards the Sea of Azov, they're now being pushed back in those areas day after day after day. So Boris Pistorius is wrong in his assessment here and his statement that the situation is bogged down and neither side is moving forward on the ground. The Russians are moving forward on the ground. The Russians are moving forward on the ground through some of the most fortified areas of Ukraine. Avdiivka is a great example. It's been fortified since 2014. It's had 10 years of fortification. And the Russians are now slowly chewing through that. Once they've captured Avdiivka, which no doubt they will, as they have it encircled and they have the one supply road under their full fire control, just like they have done with Bakhmut and other cities before that. Once they do that in that area, Ukraine doesn't have the same level of fortified big cities. Well, not huge cities, but fortified sites like Avdiivka, who have a big industrial plant in the middle of them full of steel, concrete and iron anyhow, which was easy to fortify even more. After Avdiivka falls, there is a big gap from there where you can push up some major roadways to much smaller settlements, which are likely to fall more quickly. So the Russians are advancing. This isn't a bogged down stalemate. This is war fighting through fortified locations. Fortified locations don't generally fall quickly. They're fortified. You have to fight to get through them. And if you were fighting to get through them and not moving at all, you might say it was bogged down. But there is movement, and it's happening day in, day out. And you can go and find this out for yourself. Just go and find some. Choose your favourite Russian or Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian mapping site and have a look at what's happened over the last month. And you'll see that the Russians are advancing. Everyone except Boris Pistorius is admitting this. Anyhow, also... And again, there's a recurring theme here in the European nations at the moment that Russia wants war with NATO. It seems that this has popped up more so in the last month. Maybe prior to that, in the West, generally they felt the narrative was, Ukraine is doing well and we're going to beat the Russians. Now it seems clear to them that the Russians are advancing and they're not going to be able to spin that story. So instead, now the story is changing to war is coming between NATO and Russia. It's unavoidable. There are reports that in Sweden, people are being told this. In Poland, they're being told this. In Germany, they're being told this. In the UK, I went through an article from the Daily Mail earlier this week. Big front page thing online about how the Russians are going to come in, cut off the Northern Sea routes. They're going to send AI tanks westward. They're going to bomb all the civilian centres in Paris and London and Helsinki. And they're getting the population ready for this. They're preparing them for this sort of thing. the British Chief of Staff, General Patrick Sanders, he has now been suggesting that Britons need to get ready for mobilisation for full war, and that hinting at we might need to get back to conscription because we have problems with the number of forces we have in the UK at the moment, and we're going to have to go to war. So we're going to have to get your heads around the fact that we might be drafting you in the near future. He said, we will not be immune, and as the pre-war generation, we must similarly prepare. And that is a whole-of-nation undertaking. Ukraine brutally illustrates that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. I'm not sure how he gets that because it doesn't look like... perhaps he's referring to Russia there, and that the massive number of volunteers, which is expanding the Russian army, not only in Ukraine but in Russia itself, is what's winning the war. So perhaps he's correct there, and I was just assuming that he was meaning it's the Ukrainians demonstrating that. The Ministry of Defence has then come out and said, trying to put this fire down, no, of course, we're not talking about conscription. Conscription was outlawed in 1960 in the UK. We would never do that again. But I think that the British public are being warmed up to the fact that that might come. So it looks as though NATO is looking for war with Russia. And by all these things are coming out. Oh, it's going to be 20 years. Within 20 years, we'll have to go to war with Russia. But then these things are leaked out. Oh, no, but the Polish leaked documents say that actually it's going to be less than that. The German ones have come out and said, well, we think it could be 5 to 8 years. But, no, it's probably longer, but it could be 5 to 8 years. The Polish documents, actually, it could be 36 months. Within 36 months, we'll have to go to war. Next week, Steadfast Defender, NATO's biggest exercises ever, start Germany, Poland, and up Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all through that area there, around the Suwalki Gap and Kaliningrad. And these are war games that are based on the fact that NATO has to go to war with Russia. So the West is getting prepared for this. When this will happen, I don't know. I would say that the West wouldn't want to enact a war with Russia for some time because of the head start that Russia has got on them in terms of military capability. Now, yes, if it was a full NATO war and all of the nations decided to send all of their men and all of their weapons down to the borders of Russia and fight, then yes, the Russians would be in for a big, heavy fight, no doubt. But NATO won't do that. NATO won't send everything down there because NATO can't send everything down there because it needs to be a defensive organisation, and Russia might not be the only place it has to defend against. So the UK is not going to send everything down there. They're going to leave some in reserve, so you're not going to get the entire NATO war stocks fighting there. Plus, every day at the moment that NATO waits, NATO is building capability. It knows if it wants to go to war with Russia, it needs to get its production facilities going again. It needs to produce more weapons. It needs to get governments to increase funding. The Germans are talking about lifting up their military funding from 2.4 to 2.5% of GDP next year, so that they can produce more and make more orders. And all of that is happening. But what is happening at a faster rate is that Russia is producing these things and the budgets are already provisioned. You've got to remember, if, for example, I'm trying to find a simple analogy here. Let's just say that you live on a hill near a river and the river is going to flood. And the river is going to flood, but you live on a hill. So if the river's going to flood, you hear that, and you should be building a wall around your house, some sandbags, you're probably like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. I'll get a few sandbags in and build it, one sandbag higher. I'm probably pretty good. If you live right next to the river on the floodplain and you hear the river is going to flood, then you're going to get your arse in gear and build a wall around your place. You're going to buy lots of sandbags and you're going to focus everything on that. And you're going to end up with a big defensive wall. Now, if we change the defensive wall to be wartime production of war materiel, then you are Russia on the riverbank and you are building that in a big way. And the NATO nations The UK, who's miles away from Russia, is slowly building it up, and Germany's building it up a bit quicker, and the US, who are miles away, is slowly building it up because the UK and Germany and the United States aren't under direct immediate threat. They're miles away from the fighting. So they just don't have that pressure. They're not on the riverbank next to the flooding river, forcing them to move to a war footing. Russia is. It's already said that. It's already doing that. All the economic information coming out of Russia is indicating that they are on a war footing. They're having a massive labour shortage of skilled labour because everybody's working double shifts. Everyone's got a job working, producing ammunition and artillery barrels and whatever it might be, and they want more of that to go on. And every day they're looking at ways of increasing that and expanding their capability. They're not slowing down and going, oh, this is enough. They know that they may end up in a conflict with NATO. Russia doesn't want a conflict with NATO. And I ask you to actually go and listen to the rhetoric from the two nations. Listen to what Lavrov and Putin say. They are constantly saying, we are open to trade and negotiation. They're constantly saying that. They are not saying we need to get ready for war with NATO. They're not saying we're going to do these big war games where we're preparing for a big war with NATO and doing it on the border and all this sort of thing. They've actually just pulled back from some war games planning that they had going on to say, look, we're actually focusing on the war that we're in right now with Ukraine and you guys. Listen to the Western press and it's all about war with Russia. But as I say, I don't think NATO's ready for this. Not yet. Because someone senior, strategically, is sitting up there and going, you know what? If we do get into a fight with Russia right now, we're a few years away from being able to produce, even collectively, the same amount of ammunition that the Russians are producing. Now, we can do that and we can get there, but it might take us a couple of years. And in a couple of years, we might have some really bad optics if we've got to put our young men on the front line down there with everyone else, and we're losing a lot of them because the Russians are entrenched in Ukraine. They built fortified positions. They've had a hell of a lot more experience than our young guys have. Now, you give us a year, we'll have learned all the tricks of the trade, but the Russians already have learnt that. These are what you now call battle-hardened. The Ukrainians have some battle-hardened forces, but their battle-hardened forces are ones which aren't getting resupplied. They are guys which are being drafted and mobilised and don't really want to be there. They are increasingly getting older and older and older, whereas the Russians are just recycling fresh volunteers through and building up experience there. I'm not being pro-Russian here. I'm being pro-logic here. You just go and look at the difference there. And so if it turns out that, you've got to start putting young UK guys and young American guys into Ukraine to fight with the Russians, they are going to be green. It's going to require a lot for NATO to suddenly have air superiority over that European battlefield, which is what they expect and what their doctrine requires in order for them to be successful. And we've seen how NATO doctrine doesn't work if they don't have that. In the Ukrainian offensive last June, July, when they moved on and tried to get to the Sea of Azov, and all of their heavy equipment got bogged down in minefields and taken out by attack helicopters and anti-tank guided missiles from the ground because they had no air support. They were expecting to go in there and have air cover to suppress the helicopters, keep the alligators out of there, suppress the guys on the ground. They're not too close. So now we can focus on the mine clearing and move our equipment forward because we've got air support. They didn't have it. It just showed that the NATO doctrines don't work if you don't have it. So NATO, getting into a fight, needs to guarantee that it's got air support, or the same thing is going to happen to the UK and the US and the German and the Polish soldiers that go there to fight. Now, while they are aware that they need that and will work to achieve that, the Russians are also aware that that's what they're going to be after. And the Russians are building up this automated AI capability. S-400's improving all the time. So their air defense capability is also growing at the same time. So it's not going to be a simple, okay, NATO's in the fight, we've got air superiority, we can go back to our old doctrines and they will work and we'll just push the Russians back. It'll be, shit, how do we try to gain air superiority here when the Russians have got good jets, when they've got better air defense than us, and they've had years of practice now looking at what our jet signatures look like? this is going to be a tough fight. Do we really want to do this? Another thing that's interesting. Now, in the last year, the Russians have been increasing the number of satellites they've been putting into the air to give them situational awareness over the battlefield and to give them additional tracking facility like GPS, or the Glasnost, I think it's called, Russian version of GPS, and they can use that. But they're not as dependent upon that as it seems the NATO systems are. The Russians have been fighting this war, and they've been doing it with other systems, and they're rapidly moving on a lot of their weaponry too to like AI image matching, so you can fire something and you can just forget about it. It doesn't need to rely upon GPS to track itself. It has enough information capability now to be able to just look at the ground and figure out where it's going and detect its target. And all these sorts of things are coming and being introduced into the drones and missiles. Both sides will be working on this, but remember, Russia is being pushed right now into really having to do it, focus on it. Russia doesn't seem to have the same level of dependence upon satellite-empowered tracking and location capabilities as NATO does. So again, if this NATO conflict happens with Russia, there's a very good chance that we'll see some Star Wars. There will be some either electronic warfare or direct destruction of these GPS satellites. Now, last week, there were reports that perhaps the Russians performed some electronic warfare GPS suppression over the Suwalki Gap. And for a period of time in Lithuania and in Poland, people lost GPS signal because what has been proposed was that the Russians, or in Belarus, they were just practicing to make sure if they wanted to take the Suwalki Gap, they could suppress GPS in that area. It makes it tough for any system that's relying on GPS to figure out where the hell it is or where the hell they're going or target things now. So if the NATO nations do have a heavier reliance upon that to operate, and the Russians don't, then it would make sense that the Russians would go, let's take some of those satellites out. And now NATO's like, oh shit, we've got all this high-tech whiz-bang technology, but it relied on that, and now we haven't got that. And so it's just not as effective. And the Russians, who have systems that don't rely on that anyhow, can continue. These are just realities, it seems, of the situation. Differences in preparation and capabilities of equipment. Now, as I say, I'm not just being pro-Russian here. I'm just trying to call out challenges that NATO will have if they decide to get into a fight with Russia. And so for that reason, I don't think they will want to do that for some time. This is why I'm suggesting, I've done a video on this called Is Sweden Next? You may want to have a look at it if you're interested in this, in some grand speculation. This is why I think that Sweden might be a nice target for the United States to push into a proxy conflict with Russia. Sweden's not in NATO yet, and it hasn't. It still has some hurdles to get there. Obviously, Turkey has just ratified in its parliament that Sweden can join, and I believe, I need to confirm, but I saw something late last night that I think President Erdogan may even now have taken the next step and signed. So Erdogan signing really means that Turkey's involvement is complete and Turkey has agreed. Sweden can join NATO. It's just Hungary now who needs to sign off on that. So Sweden's still not in NATO, and President Erdogan has tied Sweden's accession to NATO to Turkey receiving a whole bunch of new F-16s and modernisation kits from the United States. So Joe Biden has sent a letter this week to leaders of committees in Congress to say, I strongly suggest that without delay, you approve this package going to Turkey. And it will be 40 new F-16s and 80 modernisation kits to be applied to some of the 270 existing F-16s that Turkey already has. Turkey can no longer get F-35s because they purchased an S-400 from the Russians. They were going to be in the F-35 program, but then the Americans said, no, we're not letting you have F-35s if you have an S-400 in your country, because it'll be sucking up information about our F-35s. You'll be able to bypass our stealth capabilities, and that'll somehow get shared with the Russians. So that's not happening. Anyhow, the F-16s, that was the deal. Turkey will allow Sweden into NATO. United States, you give us more F-16s. So I think that we might see Hungary waiting for a little bit, just waiting until the F-16 deal is confirmed to Turkey, and then Hungary will sign, and then Sweden might go in. There could be other reasons for it to be delayed, or it might happen faster than that. I don't know. But right now, there is a benefit to Sweden not being in NATO. They are, to all intents and purposes, considered by the West as being in NATO now. They've had the big celebration that they're going to join. Everyone else has said yes. They are the one non-NATO nation that is being involved to the Steadfast Defender NATO exercises. So there's the 31 NATO nations and Sweden. Now, where Sweden is on a map is that it's surrounded by NATO nations. Finland and Iceland around it. They're all NATO nations, all around the Baltic Sea. Everyone is NATO except for Kaliningrad, a tiny little oblast, which is Russia, and Sweden, which is still non-NATO. This provides an advantage to NATO, I believe, at this stage. And that advantage is they could do a Ukraine version 2.0 with Sweden, in that they could get Sweden to enact an attack on Kaliningrad and use Swedish forces to act as a proxy and lead a fight on Kaliningrad. The reason this is good is because if Sweden does this on its own, for whatever engineered reason, then NATO isn't dragged into the conflict. That's why Germany is hesitant to give Taurus missiles, because if they were used against Moscow, Moscow's already said, if you guys do that, if you give the Ukrainians weapons that can strike us at a long range, it's a red line, we will consider you to be a combatant. And so Berlin will be struck. And that's an attack on a NATO nation, which means NATO now has to enact Article 5, which means everyone has to get in and fight. And if they don't, they look weak. So they don't want to be pushed into that position right now. Because if Russia just said, oh, fuck it, let's get them into the fight, and just bombed Berlin or London, they would go, right, it's war. And they would go, oh, shit, we're not ready for war. This isn't good for us. We don't want to do this yet. We want to do this in 2 years' time, maybe. Or 3 years' time, we've had a chance to catch up. Sweden offers that opportunity to Russia to attack Kaliningrad and maybe try to capture Kaliningrad and take the Suwalki Gap and stop the threat of Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia becoming isolated. Because if the Russians take the Suwalki Gap and join Kaliningrad with Belarus, then those three little nations, NATO nations, are now isolated by land. They can only get out by the Baltic Sea. And they have Kaliningrad, or Russia, to the south of them, able to give them some grief if they try to go past via naval methods through the Baltic. It's a very sensitive spot right there. And so Sweden, not being NATO, could be employed to attack Kaliningrad, attempt to take Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap, and now deny Russia the ability to cut off the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, because Sweden is not in NATO. So if Russia pounds the hell out of Sweden, that's okay, because everyone else doesn't have to join in until they're ready. But then at any stage, as soon as they felt they were ready, they could go, Hungary, sign the document, whatever. They could allow Sweden in. Sweden becomes NATO, and then the next bullet to be fired at a Swedish soldier brings about Article 5 of NATO, and NATO is ready, and NATO can get into the fight when it wants to. As I say, I don't think they're ready now. They will be in a few years, I'm sure, if they put their mind to it. But right now, Sweden gives them the opportunity to go, okay, Ukraine's not working, or we're getting pushed back to the Dnieper. We know that's as far as President Putin wants to go. Anyhow, once it gets to that stage, if we want to keep fighting, well, why don't we open up the front with Kaliningrad? And we could use Sweden to do that. Might be completely mind-bonkingly wrong, but I can see the benefits to it. Anyhow, we still have in Ukraine power struggle. We've got problems there. I've done a video recently too, which is on, is Zelensky out, General Zelensky out, or are we about to see a coup in Ukraine? Again, wild speculation from me, but based on some things that we're seeing. Some of the things that we're seeing are reports that President Zelensky wants to fire Zelensky. We have reports from a couple of months ago that he actually sent aides to Zelensky to say, you've got to go. And Zelensky turned around and said, I'm not going. I've done a great job. You're the one that's cocked this up. If you want to fire me, you fire me publicly in front of everyone and you deal with the consequences. Zelensky hasn't done that, and Zelensky hasn't done that because he knows that in a presidential choice, the Ukrainian public prefer Zelensky. There was a survey done recently by a Ukrainian group, and they have seen support for Zelensky at 37% for him to take the presidential role versus only 15% for Zelensky to retain the presidential role. Not only that, Zelensky is considered to have good standing and following within the military of Ukraine. And there's this old quote, I don't recall who said it, but if I'm going to bet on a coup, I'm betting on the side with the tanks. Now, the side with the tanks is General Zelensky. And he, as I've gone through in that video, I believe he has two groups of people to overcome, and he has a way to overcome both of them. Those two groups are those members within the military who are already loyal to him because he's their commander-in-chief and who probably don't like Zelensky a great deal. And then there are those who have been mobilised, who are older, who don't really want to be there, that he would need to overcome, but it's pretty easy for him to do by saying, you know what, guys, I want to end this conflict. I want to get you back to your families. And President Zelensky is the one who caused you to be here in the first place, not me. Suddenly he's got the whole military behind him. Zelensky's got no military behind him. And a coup occurs and Zelensky becomes president. Now there's that. There's talk of Julia Tymoshenko, the former prime minister of Ukraine, possibly putting her hat, waving a hat and putting it in the ring that she might be happy to be president and might be better able to negotiate with the Russians and still keep a good relationship with the US afterwards. Who knows? There is talk that Zelensky wants to remove Zelensky and put Krilo Budanov into the job. Krilo Budanov is the head of the GRU, which is the Military Intelligence Directorate. He is not a commander. He has had special forces experience himself as an individual, but he's not been a commander. But the thinking here is that Zelensky may want him in the top job commanding the military because the Ukraine is losing this fight. They can't go on the offensive anymore. They don't have the funding, they don't have the weapons, they don't have the men, but they could go on a defensive and then an insurgency path. So they could look to just annoy the hell out of Russia for the coming years by inserting, whenever they could, Ukrainian terrorist military units to go and blow things up in Russia and cause problems for Russia that way. Very annoying for Russia, hard to stamp out. And that's the sort of work that Krilo has experience in with his military intelligence and covert operations and missions and that type of thing. So maybe he would do that. Or also, one of the reasons is because he's military intelligence, he would be able to keep an eye on all the other generals for Zelensky and determine who might be looking to plot a coup against Zelensky and pick them off for him. So there is definitely concern from Zelensky's side that he may be looking at losing the presidency. He's already shut down the elections that were meant to happen this year because he knows that he won't win in a vote against some of the other contenders. But this, again, there are things coming out from within Ukraine. So this is from a Ukrainian channel. I'm just going to read a little bit of this here. A deputy from Zelensky's Servant of the People party, Mariana Bezulglaya, who has been criticising General Zelensky, the chief of the general staff, since the end of last year, has suggested replacement candidates for him. She mentioned that there are already many rumours circulating, hinting at the possibility of replacing the chief of the general staff within the Strategy 2024 change. Bezuglaya is considering 3 individuals as replacements. The head of the main intelligence directorate, Krilo Budanov, Evgeny Moisyuk, Zelensky's deputy, and former commander of the airborne forces, Alexander Siersky, who's commander of the ground forces. This Minister of Parliament clarifies that this is not insider information, but rather her personal impressions and observations. Now, if she's a deputy from the Servant of the People Party, which is Zelensky's party, then I'm sure that she has been approved to say this stuff. And, and obviously and clarifying that, this isn't insider information. This is just my personal impressions and observations. But she's been okay to say this. So Zelensky now making it public that there is pressure on Zelensky, that Zelensky should be worried, that we're looking at his deputies, we're looking at Kirillo to come in and take his role, trying to undermine and destabilise him. So I see Zelensky being pushed to a point here where he either says, okay, they're going to get rid of me, yeah, I'm good, that's fine, I'll go. Probably doesn't end well for him. Or he says, you know what, I think I've done a good job. I'm in control of these military forces. I'm going to take that job and shut this down. So I would say that the chances of a military coup occurring in Ukraine are increasing by the day and will increase until some resolution around Zelensky's role comes. And it seems as though even internally, while they're not talking of a coup, they are members of Zelensky's parliament are certainly talking about the precipitating factors being there that might force Zelensky to make that decision and enact a coup. Also from another Ukrainian channel, Telegram channel, talking about the economy. Obviously, again, just common sense, the economy in Ukraine is not going well. There are, and this report mentioned this, but I'll mention this too. There are reports that the Ukrainian economy is growing from 2022 to 2023 by 4 to 5%. That may somehow be the case, but if it is, it's after it dropped in 2022 by 30 to 50%. So, this isn't actual growth of the Ukrainian economy. This is probably more likely inflation impacting what looks like growth. And remember that the money that is coming to sustain Ukraine is not coming from the Ukrainian economy. This is a false impression. This isn't the Ukrainian economy growing, manufacturing a lot, exporting more than it imports. This is the Ukrainian economy being given loans to survive on, and those loans somehow need to be paid back in the future. So, but I'll just read through these couple of statements here, and again, this is translated, but from a Ukrainian source. It says, "The real situation with our business is simply deplorable. The security forces are squeezing out everything, not for the budget, but through kickbacks. But no one wants to talk about it." And here, what I think we are starting to hear is from Ukrainian internal business sources that they are suffering corruption in the form of standover techniques, extortion by the security forces over the businesses. Ukrainian business is dying due to the lawlessness of the security forces, says Anatoly Amelin, director of the economics program of the Ukrainian Institute of the Future Analytical Center. According to him, at a recent meeting of entrepreneurs with government officials, there was a businessman who said that since the beginning of the war, due to the lawlessness of the security forces, the number of his employee has decreased from 400 to 90 people. Now, that's just one example. I'm not really basing it all on this, but I'll just go on. He says, "I won't give a penny. I will fight to the end. Bring people to the streets. Business is already in despair. Business is broke. When they say that entrepreneurs have money, it's a lie, because there are hundreds of billions of hryvnia of unrefunded VAT, which is a tax, blocked VAT, unregistered tax invoices. This is one case. Second, you cannot take a loan. Defence industry enterprises cannot take a loan," said Amelin. "The economy is no longer there. The growth figures that are depicted for us are a consequence of inflation. And even those, when we lost 30% of the economy but grew by 4 or 5, this is not growth, this is a convulsion," he added. According to Amelin, the economy is beginning to collapse, and when the president calls for doing business in Ukraine, business is baptized. According to him, many businesses go abroad and do not return, because in Ukraine, they put a gun to their head and try and take their money. So, Obviously, the Ukrainian economy is suffering because it's in war. It doesn't have access to the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv anymore. It can't export through those areas, so it's suffering not being able to export. It's being forced to travel overland through Poland, Slovakia, Lithuania. Now, all of these nations, Romania, all of these nations over the last few months have been enacting periodic blockades of the transit points into Ukraine, not letting products in, delaying products going out. All of these things are having an impact on the economy. If you can't have the free flow of goods in and out of your nation, you will struggle to be able to keep your economy afloat. So there are those problems, but now this is a report from inside Ukraine. It's not from a Russian source, and that the director of the economics program of the Ukrainian Institute of the Future is suggesting that things are bad. And from reading between the lines and trying to interpret this, it seems as though they are suffering under extortion from the security forces. Putting, in his words, putting a gun to their head and trying to take their money, talking about businessmen saying that they won't give a penny to these guys. So this is not good news economically for Ukraine. And I'm not trying to be anti-Ukraine here. I'm just trying to talk about what is logically happening to a nation that is in war, losing the war, losing lots of its men. It's resorting to have to mobilize women into its frontline positions. And economically, it is suffering dreadfully. And even if the conflict were to stop tomorrow, and even if Russia were then to say, guess what, we're happy to trade with you, tomorrow, Ukraine has decades and decades of hardship in front of it before it is able to recover from this. All right, let's just move to the front line and have a look at what's happened there. I'm just going to talk a little bit here through the weekly summary. This is the Russian Ministry of Defense weekly summary numbers. The Russian Ministry of Defense provides a daily update of what has happened in the fighting along the front line and a weekly one. This is the weekly one, so this is covering from the 20th to the 26th of January. The Ministry of Defence talks about that they, during that week, delivered 13 group strikes of long-range precision weapons, including missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. These were aimed at facilities of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, specifically locations producing uncrewed surface vehicles, so UAV watercraft. This is probably ones around the Mykolaiv area and Odessa, which would be manufactured to then produce water drone-based attacks on Crimea, because we did have reports again of heavy strikes on Odessa. Ammunition producing locations. There was a report of one last week, early this week, producing the detonation caps, I think, for inside artillery shells, production of missiles and their parts. In addition, they say strikes were delivered at ammunition depots, military airfield infrastructure, POL or POL bases, these are petroleum, oil and lubrication stores, and temporary deployment areas of foreign mercenaries. Here, I'm talking about the strikes in Kharkiv upon the location where the French mercenaries were, where a group of reportedly 60 or more French mercenaries, perhaps 80 French mercenaries, were housed. They were struck, and 60 of them reportedly killed. This resulted in the French ambassador being recalled to Moscow. And the Russians asking for a UN Security Council inquiry into this, and the French saying, no, we don't have anything to do with this, but it looking like the French had organised the supply of these mercenaries. Anyhow, different topic. I won't go into that deeper right now. So going through the lines, the Russian Ministry of Defense figures for the week. In Kupiansk, direction, the Russians repelled 43 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces. These were around areas of Makayevka, Berestowye, Sinkovka and Terny, and were involving brigades from the Ukrainians of the 68th Jaeger Brigade, the 25th, the 30th, the 32nd, the 43rd, the 57th, the 60th and the 66th Mechanised Brigades, as well as airborne brigades. The reported loss in Ukrainian servicemen in the last week in the area of Kupiansk fighting is 740 troops, 7 tanks, 7 armoured fighting vehicles, and 14 field artillery pieces. Moving down to the Krasny Liman direction, there, the Russians report that 17 attacks were initiated by the Ukrainians, which have been repelled. These occurred around Chervonaya Dubrova, Yampolovka and Serbryansky forestry areas. Reportedly, the Ukrainian losses in this week of fighting in the Krasny Liman area amount to 1,570 troops killed and wounded, 7 tanks, 25 armoured fighting vehicles, 9 field artillery pieces. Moving into Donetsk, the reports are that 12 AFU, or Armed Forces of Ukraine, attacks were repelled in this week, involving the 22nd, the 24th, the 28th, the 42nd, the 58th, the 92nd and the 93rd Mechanised Brigades, plus the Airborne Brigade of the 81st and a 5th Assault Brigade. These, in the Donetsk area, were occurring around Andriivka and Kleshayevka, which is just south of Bakhmut, and Belgorovka to the west, Mayorsk and the Chasov Yar area. So now the Russians moving to the west past Bakhmut and beginning to approach on Chasov Yar, which is again a fortified location for the Ukrainians. Reportedly, the losses amount to more than 1,960 troops killed and wounded in this week, 19 tanks, including a Leopard, 22 armoured fighting vehicles, 4 multiple launch rocket systems, including a HIMARS and some Grads, and 27 field artillery pieces. Moving down to the South Donetsk area, fighting occurred around Priotne, Novomykhailovka and Staromayorsk. In this area, reportedly 745 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded, 1 tank, 2 armoured fighting vehicles and 14 field artillery pieces. Moving further to the west, the southwest in Zaporozhye, fighting involved the Ukrainian 33rd, 65th, 117th and 118th Mechanised Brigades, plus the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. The fighting was focused around Robotne, Verbova, and Pyatikhatki further to the west. Reportedly, more than 450 Ukrainian troops killed or wounded in this week of fighting in Zaporozhye region, 3 tanks destroyed, 4 armoured fighting vehicles, and 11 field artillery pieces. Finally, moving down to the Kherson region, where we have seen the bridgehead of Krinky shrinking over the last week as the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians out of there. Fighting has involved the 35th, 36th and 38th Marine Brigades, the 121st, 123rd and 126th Ukrainian Territorial Defence Brigades, and this fighting has been around Chaginka, Smievka and Stanislav. Reportedly in Kherson in this week, 335 Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded, 2 Grad MLRS systems destroyed, and 8 field artillery pieces destroyed. Now, as I said, in this week of fighting, we see 3, 4, 23, 30, 37. So at least, that's on a quick look through there, reports of 37 tanks destroyed in this week of fighting, Ukrainian tanks destroyed. Remember, in the German aid package, they are looking or planning to provide 80 tanks to Ukraine in 2024. Now, then they may announce more later on. But at this stage, while Ukraine appears to have lost almost 40 tanks in a week of fighting, Germany will be providing them with 80 in 2024, which means that Germany is providing them at this rate of loss 2 weeks' worth of tanks. The total reported number of servicemen, Ukrainian servicemen killed and wounded for the week is 5,800. That is less than 1,000 a day. And that number reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense is less than what a Ukrainian interior minister from the Verkhovna Rada has come out and stated this week the Ukrainians are losing. That member of the Ukrainian parliament has come out and stated that Ukraine is losing 1,000 men killed or wounded per day, 30,000 per month. Many people criticise the fact that I use the Russian Ministry of Defense figures here and report upon them. I use them because they are at least consistent. They come out each day and they come out each week with their summary. Their numbers, given Ukraine's parliament's own reported losses for Ukrainian soldiers killed and wounded, the Russian Ministry of Defense figures are lower than those numbers. So I don't feel that you can claim that these numbers are orders of magnitude wrong or ridiculous. When Ukrainian parliamentarians are suggesting that their losses are actually higher than that. If the Russians were being orders of magnitude higher, or even on par with what the Ukrainian Interior Minister has said, the Russian numbers should be well over 7,000 this week, or 70,000 to be an order of magnitude different, which would be somewhat ridiculous. But they're not. They're suggesting over the course of the week, 5,800 Ukrainians have been killed or wounded in the fighting. 83 pieces of artillery. Now, the numbers of artillery that are destroyed each week reported by the Russians are varying over the last few weeks from as low as 54 to as high as 116. While in the weekly summary, they don't give the number of mobile self-propelled pieces, but those numbers on a daily basis seem to be growing, with a large number of this 83 reported actually being mobile pieces, which is a severe loss for the Ukrainian capability if they're losing their self-propelled and mobile artillery pieces. Anyhow, if you choose to believe those numbers, the position for the Ukrainians on the front line does not appear to be getting any better. Just want to move on from Ukraine now and talk a little bit more. I'm just going to jump quickly to one thing in Africa, and then I'll finish up around a little bit of the Middle East. Russia has been filling the void left by Western nations in Africa. France, after the coup in July last year, has been ousted from Niger. And since then, subsequent to that, there have been Russian military and foreign ministry delegates going to Niger and strengthening relationships there, strengthening military and economic relationships with Niger and Russia. In the Central African Republic, this has also been happening. In the Central African Republic, they have reportedly put aside a block of land which can hold up to 10,000 soldiers. And they are saying, this is for you, Russia. We want you to come. We want to form military ties with you. The Western military ties have been bad for us. We want to form this for you. Here is this area we can develop into a base for 10,000 of your soldiers, your Russian soldiers, to be here. Now, reports that in Burkina Faso, a Russian contingent of 100 personnel has arrived in Burkina Faso, and they will ensure security of the country's leader, Ibrahim Traore, and provide assistance to local military forces in the fight against terrorists within their nation. The arrival of an additional 200 servicemen from Russia is expected in the near future. So geopolitically, we see Russia strengthening itself and its position in Africa as well. Now, this helps supplement Russia's already rich resource base with the resources of Africa. What appears to be different here is that Russia is moving in a modern era, establishing military and economic relations with these nations, whereas the Western nations are exiting after decades and centuries of colonial rule in these nations. The difference being that the African nations are very keen to see the Westerners leave, and are very keen to begin trading with the Russians. So the Russians are getting access to resources, but it seems as though they are doing it through deals being agreed with these nations. So these nations are receiving military support from Russia, protection in some cases, and then trading with them. Russia is growing as a military power in Africa, while the West is receding in that area, it seems. Something to be aware of as energy wars begin to grow. There's a lot of uranium in Niger, which is now not going to France. And people say, sure, they can just pivot somewhere else. And they can pivot somewhere else. They can go to Australia and buy it from there. But these just make them have to pivot, perhaps increasing their costs, making it difficult, providing an area where they could have previously had cheap resources they no longer can. And all these stresses make stresses on running your economy and keeping your politicians in power. Moving to the Middle East, overnight or early this morning, about 2 o'clock in local Israeli time, the International Court of Justice has sort of made its first announcement and ruling, and it has come out and said, Israel, you must stop what you are doing and ensure there is not genocide. Now, they haven't come out and said, Israel, you're committing genocide. I don't think anyone really expected that they would come out and say that. These large political organisations are heavily influenced and they move very slowly on topics like that, and calling genocide is a big step for them. So they will, they've said you have to avoid genocide, and they've managed to include the word genocide in there. Now, of course, members of Israel's military and government have come out with the usual defence, the usual line, and saying that the International Court of Justice is anti-Semitic and you shouldn't listen to them. And in fact, we won't listen to anything they say that could impact Israel's ability to defend itself. So that's what's happened with the South African appeal to the International Court of Justice. I think, as many expected, it's going to have little impact on what Israel will do. Now, there is discussions going on between the CIA and Mossad. The CIA, the American, foreign security service; Mossad, Israel's foreign security service. Israel has the Shin Bet, and the Shin Bet is like the Americans' FBI. They are the domestic security services, or like the SBU in Ukraine. And then there is also in Israel, there is Amman, and Amman is the military intelligence organization, which is like the Ukraine's GRU, which Kirilo Badanov heads up. But CIA and Mossad are meeting. They are talking about prisoner hostage swap. CIA Director William Burns and Mossad Chief David Barnea are going to meet with Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, and they will look to find a way to discuss the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. Apparently, talks had broken down between Israel and Hamas. There was some speculation that things were moving towards an agreement, and that agreement would see Israel pausing its military action and bombing activities while the prisoner swap happened. Israeli military leaders have come out and said, no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to pause our activities. And so those negotiations seem to have fallen apart. And so now Hamas and CIA are going to meet with the Qatari leadership. Now, Qatar is where the main Hamas leadership resides, where their main fundraising and financing and organisational support comes from, is Qatar. That's why that's happening there. Apparently, the Egyptian intelligence chief, Abbas Kamel, will also be involved in the meeting. As will Ronen Bar, who is the head of Shin Bet, the FBI for Israel. Now, Egypt is interesting because there are reports that the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has rejected calls from Benjamin Netanyahu to have a phone call with him. The last time apparently that they spoke was in June last year, when a Egyptian security border force, like Egyptian police patrolman, a young guy, 22, had some episode. Reportedly, he had a breakdown because a colleague of his had been killed. I don't know the details of who or how his colleague was killed, but he, on the border, got into a firefight with some IDF forces, killing 3 of them and wounding 1. Apparently, that's the last time they spoke, was about that. Anyhow, reports are that Benjamin Netanyahu's office, via the National Security Council, tried to coordinate a conversation with El-Sisi, and he had rejected it. Now, there are tensions here to do with who will control the Egyptian-Gaza border after the conflict, with Israel asserting that it will control it. And Egypt saying, well, hang on, that area of the Sinai, that's us too. This is border with us. We don't think you should just be able to say outright that you can control it. We want to control it. There's also talk that Israel wants to conduct some sort of military exercise on the border, and Egypt not particularly happy about that. So this is of interest if we're starting to see a breakdown in communication between Israel and Egypt. Remember, they border each other. The Rafah crossing into Gaza is there. The Egyptians supportive of the Arabs in Gaza. The Egyptians not wanting to just open the borders and let the Gazans into the Sinai area, because they believe that they will never then be able to return. So this is a tough ethical, moral question. It'd be one to sit down and drink some whiskey about and talk to and think about. Like in that situation, if you believe that letting those people out will see them exiled from their land forever, do you do that? Or do you not let them out when you know that not letting them out may see them exterminated in their land? It's a tough one. Maybe you fall the way that the Egyptians have, where you're more confident that they will never return to their land, and you believe there's an opportunity that the killing might stop. Something might happen and the killing will stop and they remain in their land, and they can then remain in their land. It's an interesting question, that one. But if communication is beginning to break down between Israel and Egypt, and if something happens here and it gets inflamed and Israel just goes ahead with some military action on the border, and El-Sisi and his government get pressure from Egyptians, then it is possible. Remember that the Egyptians and the Israelis fought in the 60s and 70s. There is the likelihood that Israel may now end up fighting Hamas internally, the West Bank internally, fighting Hezbollah on the northern border, and fighting Egypt on its southern border, with the Houthis trying to lob missiles over Saudi Arabia at them. They're getting themselves really embroiled and surrounded on all sides, and getting to a point where they either have to do some sort of concession and backing down, or this does erupt into a war on Israel, dragging the United States in, and we end up with a massive conflict. All right, that's it for today. Look, it's the weekend. I hope you're having a good weekend. I'll try to put together another one of these for tomorrow, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.